Nevada Democrats are planning a showdown with Republican Governor Joe Lombardo over, get this, free school meals. Last year, the governor vetoed a measure to use $43 million of American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA money, to keep kids fed. So the Nevada Dems have submitted a bill draft proposal to get it back into next year's legislative session. Last week, however, the governor shot back that while he did veto the Dem plan for all kids, he insists there's still a path for free meals for school kids in need. Today on CityCast Las Vegas, we revisit a conversation with food justice advocate Kim Foster. As students head back to school, Kim explains how these free meals impact families in the Las Vegas Valley and some pitfalls of our current system. It's Monday, August 26th. I'm David Figler, and here's what Las Vegas is talking about. Kim, free lunch sounds nice and all, but this money coming from the American Rescue Plan, the ARPA funds, could have been spent in a lot of different ways. Why is free food at school so important?
Well, free food at school is a way to make sure that kids from unstable, struggling families have the extra food that they need so that they have lunch on the weekends, lunch during the school day. That's a breakfast, a lunch, and an after-school backpack can pretty much feed a kid for a full day. So these things are really important so that the kids who are in struggling communities and those parents have extra access to food for their kids.
But this is $43 million, and it's going to all students. I mean, even families that can afford breakfast, lunch, and diamonds on the dinner. So why not just have it being paid to the kids, like you mentioned, who need it?
Well, when you do that, it sets up a stratification so that there's kids who don't need free lunch and there's kids who do need free lunch. And the world is really full of stories from the old days when only the poorest kids had free lunch and there were cards or different kinds of ways for people to pay, and it marked them as needing free lunch. It marked them as poor, and it created a stratification. And so in order to do that, the goal has been to make lunch completely free, or breakfast and lunch completely free, so that there is no marcation of people who are poor.
I'm going to go a little personal here. Growing up in Las Vegas, I was one of those kids. We used to get red tickets. I have a visual memory of getting my red ticket and getting my food. Oftentimes, I would give those tickets away or sell those tickets to other kids because I didn't really love the food and I wasn't a big eater. I was a really tiny kid. But as far as how kids are eating or using those tickets, was that really part of the data, or is this just kind of a feel-good, dare I say, socialist movement to just make sure the kids get fed? And there's no doubt that kids need to get fed, but is this a flawed approach to it in any way?
Well, there are a few downsides to universal school lunch, and one of them is food waste. And this is one of the things that people say. I think that the reason that there hasn't been policy around it is because there is no way to make sure that the kids who need to get it, even if the kids who don't need it are getting it as well. And I love that you talked about the red tickets and selling them and that kind of stuff. And I think I think there is food waste here in a bunch of different ways. But I also think that there is no formidable plan or policy that could stand in for that.
Are there any other limitations, Kim, in the way Nevada's current free school meal program works besides the potential for food waste?
Well, one of the things that has always really been problematic for me is that there is a very significant influence of branded foods, not only in actual school lunches, but in school stores. And so a lot of the tastes of children are being set by branded food. And
what kind of brands? I'm sorry to interrupt, but what kind of brands are we talking about?
We're talking about Lay's, we're talking about Doritos, Takis, those kinds of things are all in the school system. And kids have those. And what happens is, so what happens is that the lunch game is very, very expensive and inefficient. And then what happens is they're constantly trying to keep costs down. And when you keep costs down, you become really at the mercy of food brands who are giving you lots of different kinds of branded foods that have been labeled healthy, but are just rejiggered from their former non-healthiness. And they are being distributed with school lunches. And these preferences, these brands are getting into schools, establishing a sort of junk food presence alongside school lunch. This is branding for the corporations. And so basically all these kids start eating all this food, and then it becomes a part of their lives. And by the time they're 20 years old, these brands have become like important parts and pieces of these kids' lives. And the marketing is like free. And so school lunch becomes free marketing.
That's fascinating to me. And I mean, you send your kids to CCSD schools. What is their school lunch experience like? I mean, what kind of stories are you hearing from them surrounding their food time?
So my older girls didn't really love school lunch. So a lot of school lunch has to be able to work for kids who maybe their parents live in weeklies and they have roach infestations, or their kitchens don't work, or there's homeless families. And so a lot of the food that comes out of CCSD is sort of packaged and created in a certain way to have multiple uses. And that's completely understandable. They have a huge facility and they're really trying to feed everybody, and they have like an impossible task. Years ago, what would happen is that your school would make your lunch at your school. And so it was a much smaller sort of, I mean, it might not even have been homemade, but it was, created by people in a kitchen, and there was a process and that kind of stuff. This no longer happens. It happens. In fact, if you go to YouTube, you can see it made. It's all factory produced. It's like an assembly line. And so that food, although it has all the basic nutrition and things that kids need, it's generally not entirely tasty. And so what we're finding, and what research has found, is that a lot of taste preferences are being set at this early age. And the food isn't that great. And so we have this opportunity to really inspire kids to make better choices and to eat different kinds of food. And I think the school system and not just our school system, but school systems around the country fail at that. So and we have this like opportunity that gets missed.
So are there sort of unhealthier levels of sugar or salt or things that kids shouldn't get? Is that part of the equation that's a concern to you?
The actual lunch itself isn't the issue. So if you get a plate of ravioli, there's nothing wrong with the ravioli. Or if you get a taco, there's nothing wrong with that taco. But kids are like inundated with sugary foods in the school food system all the time. I'll give you an example. John S. Park, which is right down the street from both of us.
That's an elementary school here.
It's an elementary school. Mm-hmm. They have a rule that you cannot bring any kind of home-cooked food like for consumption in the class. So when one of my kids went there, I went down and said, hey, I'd like to do this thing that I did in New York, which was in one of my daughter's classes. We had this thing called first grade soup, and we would go in and the kids would make soup and then they would eat soup. Right.
That sounds fun.
It's an amazing thing. And not only is it amazing, like fun, it's also amazing because you could see like they hated cream of tomato soup in September, but by the time you got to April, they were like, yes, we love cream of tomato soup. Like it just became like you can really set the preferences of kids. John S. Park told us that they would not allow any kind of food for the class unless it was like processed. And so what happens is, even at a party, I couldn't make like, some really great like stuffed manicotti or, a soup or whatever. I couldn't even make homemade pizza and bring it. Instead, when you go to those parties, there's case after case after case of like chips and sugary drinks. And my kids go to that school store all the time. And that school store is filled with junk. So any good that we know that school lunch has to have a certain amount of nutrients for the kids. And we know that that's there because they're doing that sort of scientifically and by the book. But it's not the only food that kids get at school. And it's highly supplemented with a lot of sugar and a lot of processed foods. And in fact, lunch is processed. I mean, if you look at that, it's baked in a factory, it is processed food.
So what? And I just want to make it really clear: the universal free food, it really applies to those basic meals. But most schools, many schools at least, and this was true way back in the Stone Age when I was a kid, had a school store where you could buy candy bars and other junky type food, sodas and things like that, and it would cost you money out of your pocket. That's not being supplemented. It is the breakfast, lunch type meals that kids line up for that's being basically taken care of by the state, right?
Correct. And we want that to happen. We want that to continue to happen. And it's not a perfect process, and the food isn't perfect. But we want to make sure that parents don't have to think about where their kids' meals are coming from, because at least that is there.
But I'm still puzzled now by what you just said. Did John S. Park tell you why you couldn't bring in like patented, really delicious and nutritious Kim Foster food? Because I've experienced that and it's amazing. What did they tell you, Kim?
Allergies.
Allergies.
But that's ridiculous, because lots and lots of schools have allergies. And also, I think, I think it just makes it easier for them. But what happens is every time there's a kid party or anything, here's my fear. My kids are going to come home and they're going to have a home cooked meal. There are some kids that the only food that they are ever going to have in the most formative years of their development is school food and processed food. And they're not going to have opportunities to have other kinds of food. And that is a real thing. So lunch helps, but it is not, but in some ways it's a Band-Aid.
You also raise this issue of the branding of foods happening around this space. And I'm wondering if any of this was discussed in the extension of funding for school lunches, et cetera, for those kids. In other words, did the legislature say, okay, here's what we want to avoid. Here's what we're going to do with this money. Here's what we're going to make sure happen. Anything like that? Any discussion like that?
No, because we don't care what kids eat. People just think, well, as long as they have full bellies, it doesn't really matter. As long as they're not crying out in hunger, it doesn't really matter.
I mean, even with the best intentions, aren't parents, especially those with more challenges economically, aren't they still taking their kids over to the fast food places that probably aren't the best for their kids either?
Of course, because that's what kids want. Kids aren't going, Mom, will you make me soup? They're going, hey, can we get a cheeseburger at McDonald's? And that's fine. I mean, look, my kids go to McDonald's. I'm not a snob about it. But what happens is we're creating a generation of kids who've never had anything but processed food, or very rarely have other options. And a lot of that is built into this idea that school food is on its own kind of fast foody. And
or even sub fast food. I mean, it's like,
or sub fast food. Yeah. I mean, during the pandemic, when I had the pantry out here, the CCSD used to take all their extra food from their lunch drives and put them in my pantry. And one of the things that we would get all the time are these things called raisels.
Spell that word for me.
R-A-I-S-E-L-S.
Okay, raisels.
And raisels are this little box, about the size of a box of Nerds, and they're raisins, but they're drenched in like sour dust, like with weird names like watermelon tropic and stuff like that, and blue raspberry, right? So they're an already sweet fruit, but then they're also like just grossly sour, right? So my kids, my little ones, would run out to the pantry and they would like be hoarding all the raisels, right? I found out that there's a school district in Colorado that served raisels as the fruit portion of public school breakfast. Raisels have something like 7 times the sugar of an orange.
Oh, awesome.
Something like that.
Sure.
Yeah. So, and of course, Colorado parents were like completely freaked out, and they, it was a big to do. And my kids would go out, and they would go out to the pantry, and they'd start stuffing raisels into their pockets.
Sure.
And like putting them inside and hiding them in their room because they're like so good. It was like little found treasures, and it was all school food. It was all school food.
Wow. Well, I mean, you did do this wonderful thing with having a pantry outside your house to help families in need, especially during the pandemic. So you had a lot of that insight. And I guess you're as well positioned as anyone to answer this last question. If you could design CCSD school lunches from the ground up with that $43 million to feed everybody, what would your meals look like? Give us some sample menus, Kim.
I would go back to, and look, I don't know how financially feasible this would be, obviously, but I would go back to individual cafeterias making individual foods for their schools. And so when a pizza would be made, it would be made on a big pan. It would be put it into the oven, and it would be made that way. And I do think that kids would benefit from foods that they recognize, like tacos and pizza and things like that. But I also think that there are ways to make those things incredibly healthy and tasty, and also provide a little bit of room to try something new. Like maybe the pizza doesn't always have to be a cheese pizza. Like maybe once it can have like something on it that is different or unique. And maybe it could be built into and integrated into the educational system, those kinds of things. Because what we're doing.
Or maybe it would turn out to be raisels.
Or maybe it would just be, yes, exactly.
Okay, no. But please continue with the perfect Kim Foster menu, because this is fascinating to me. Because, you only see this idea of, and I'm just going to say this euphemistically, the lunch lady in old movies, right? And
right.
And it is kind of derided as well as a concept of being like slop, but it doesn't have to be. So what are some other menu items that your ideal lunch person is cooking up with the staff at these various elementary schools in town?
I would always have a hot soup so that kids can have a hot soup and maybe some bread with that. I would go with things that they recognize. I would definitely still go with tacos and burritos and things like that. You can make them super healthy. I mean, who wouldn't want like a tacos El Gordo taco from like, a long cooked, beautiful pork roast? You know what I mean? We also need to represent the cultures of our kids and our food. So we have a big Hawaiian population, and who wouldn't want to have some beautiful like Hawaiian food? Or we have a large Ethiopian community now, so maybe Ethiopian food occasionally. Those things could also become like educational. And if they were done through the school cafeteria, you could actually keep the cost down. And then you could also be making food that could really taste yummy for the kids.
Wow. Well, I'm going to go here right now, Kim. That's amazing food for thought. And literally.
All day about how to
I've just been waiting for that. I've been waiting for that one. It's just been in my pocket, getting moldy with the raisels. Kim Foster, always enlightening talking with you. Thank you so much for joining us again on CityCast Las Vegas.
Thanks for having me.
That's all for today here on CityCast Las Vegas. If you enjoyed the show, please go tell a friend. You could also rate our show. That's a nice thing. Leave us a review and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Till then, stay lucky.